Duke or Michigan State? Does Purdue deserve a top 5 spot? Does the SEC deserve to have 2 top 10 teams? Leif Thulin breaks down his preseason top 25 on today's Locked On College Basketball.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more, and right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, it is Thursday, meaning we are joined today by Leif Thulin, contributor at the Locked On NBA Big Board and regular guest here on Locked On College Basketball. And we're going to take a little break from our conference preview series. We'll be back with another conference on Friday as we get closer and closer to the college basketball season. But want to take a break from that today to discuss Leif's top 25. Came out with that list on Twitter a couple days ago. So we're going to take a look at those teams, see where Leif is kind of compared to the consensus, with the understanding that in late September, a consensus top 25 ranking just doesn't really exist. We're going to talk about the teams that Leif's maybe a little higher on, a little lower on, why that is as we get through this list and into the start of October and eventually the start of the college basketball season. So Leif, I'm going to go ahead and read your top 10. And we'll talk about a few questions there before we move into the rest of the list. So at the top here, we got Duke, Michigan State, and Kansas, 1, 2, and 3. Purdue comes in at number 4. Marquette is 5. Houston is 6. UConn is 7. Tennessee is 8. Creighton is 9. And then the Aggies of Texas A&M rounding out the top 10. And Leif, let's start at the top here, because I think we're seeing Duke, Michigan State, and Kansas in some variety or different order, basically being the consensus top 3 at this point. You have them ordered Duke, then followed by Tom Izzo's Spartans, followed by Bill Self and the Jayhawks. Do you kind of have those 3 teams all sort of lumped together? Is there kind of a tier in between those 3 teams, or is it kind of one of those things where any of them could be at the top, but I just prefer Duke for such and such reasons?
I think Duke clearly has the best roster in college basketball this year. And that's not to say it's stunning, because they've had amazing rosters in years past. But this year they come back with experience. I would argue very strongly their best player is Tyrese Proctor. And yet all the publications that are respected have Kyle Filipowski as an All-American. And so if that's a question where someone like me would argue, even last year when Tyrese Proctor was a 17-year-old, turned 18 during the season, was probably the best player on Duke's team throughout the majority of the season when they played well. And now he's coming back for a sophomore year. You typically don't see that. You typically see a guy go in the lottery. So I think they have a lottery pick at point guard in Tyrese Proctor. I think Kyle Filipowski is one of the best college basketball players, but he's not one of the best on his team. They also bring back an experienced guard in Jeremy Roach. They bring in good athletes in their freshman class that can play complementary roles, won't need the ball to be starring. And then they also have Mark Mitchell, who already fits that description of kind of a glue guy who can play the 3 or the 4. And I think that John Shire, because he's recruited a lot of these guys, even into the Coach K tenure, really has a way of developing them. So I'm pretty optimistic about the Blue Devils. For those of you who know me, I do not like Duke, but they really do have a very good team. I would say there is a difference between them, Michigan State, and Kansas. And I would say Purdue, from what I looked at, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't forgetting anyone. So I tried to build this on my own, but I would look at sites and be like, okay, did I miss anyone obvious? And Purdue, and most of the ones I looked at, was ahead of Michigan State in the Big Ten. So I thought I was going out on a minor little limb here, because I like what Tom Izzo has more than I like what Matt Painter has. Matt Painter's got a known commodity, and they're going to improve because they're going to be hungry. They're going to be frustrated. But to me, Izzo's got 3 guards that are old, very good. They return their starting 5 and bring in a top recruiting class with guys that can really influence the game. Like Xavier Booker could be compared to Jaren Jackson Jr. I think Jeremy Fears, I listened to a podcast with Tom Izzo on Monday, and Izzo said he's got the leadership ability of Mateen Cleaves. For those of you who know basketball, Mateen Cleaves was the starting point guard for the team that won in 2000. So maybe he's not ready yet, but that really bodes well. You
Mm-hmm.
still have Mady Sissoko. You still got Malik Hall in the front court. So I really like them even more than a Kansas team that I'm actually a little lower on, which sounds weird because I have them at 3.
Mm-hmm.
I just think they've got the more established talent than most of the other teams that are still lurking from numbers 5 through 10.
Yeah. Yeah, I Michigan State and Purdue, we are seeing both those teams in the top 5 a lot. But I think you're right. I do think that the majority of publications do have Purdue higher. And it's kind of one of those things where Purdue was the better team last year throughout the regular season. They, of course, got the higher seed in March, even though they didn't advance as far as Michigan State did. But I do wonder if Michigan State is – I don't want to say they're getting overlooked because we are continually seeing them in the top 5. But the conversation around Purdue is about how they're returning everybody. So is Michigan State. And Michigan State is returning players who – were already more experienced. Like Purdue's returning a lot of sophomores, which is great for them. I think it's going to work really well. I think that freshman backcourt last year now coming into their own as sophomores is probably going to show some significant improvement, which is going to be huge because they really need somebody else on that roster to step up so that Zach Edey isn't kind of shouldering the entire load. But I do think that it's like Michigan State returning 23-year-old guys. Like they're returning multiple older players, and the newcomers joining Michigan State's roster are going to have a bigger impact in year 1 than the newcomers joining Purdue's roster. I think that's fairly obvious because Purdue didn't bring a whole lot of guys in. They got one transfer coming in, some other freshmen, but nobody expected to play a huge role. Whereas Xavier Booker could have a big role in year 1. You mentioned Fears. He's probably going to be a little bit on the back burner a little bit, I guess, because they already have so much veteran guards. You have a guy like Cohen Carr, not exactly sure where he's going to fit in, but that dude can jump out of the freaking gym. So you can't hate having a guy like that. So I like Michigan State over Purdue. I think it's totally defensible. Probably the direction that I'm going to go as well, just because I think that we're sleeping a little bit on how impactful the amount of depth and the amount of experience Tom Izzo's team is bringing back this year.
One more point about Michigan State is I think for those of you who've watched a lot of Tom Izzo over the years, they do better when they have more depth. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, they need a star player. Like Cassius Winston's the last Michigan State team, him and Xavier Tillman, and the team was built around them, but they would play 9-10 guys. Last year's team played basically 7 or 8. Mm-hmm. I think Michigan State gets back to pressuring a little more defensively, forcing a few more turnovers, playing a little faster because they can afford to do so. And maybe that means that some of these guys – like their starting 3 guards are probably going to play a lot, but I think maybe Malik Hall and Mady Sissoko play in spurts. Xavier Booker, Cohen Carr play in spurts, and I think that's really going to be beneficial. Jackson Kohler is a good offensive player, not great defensively. Maybe he can, use his strengths more so as opposed to what Izzo had to kind of like mix and match more in the past year. So that's why I'm really high, and I also think Izzo's probably the best coach right now. Him and Bill Self are probably the best 2 coaches in college basketball.
Well, looking at the bottom half of the top 10 here, you got 3 Big East teams in Marquette and UConn and Creighton at 5, 7, and 9. You got Houston at 6. Then you got those 2 SEC teams, Tennessee at 8 and A&M at 10. And I want to start there because, again, those 3 Big East teams are pretty routinely kind of showing up in that same spot. I think Houston's kind of right around where we're typically seeing them. But what stands out a little bit is these 2 SEC teams. And I think certainly they're kind of in that mix as top 15, top 20 teams when you look kind of around the industry right now. But you seem to be a little bit higher on those 2 teams than most. And certainly with Tennessee, the health of Zakai Ziegler is a big question in terms of that team's how quickly they can hit the ground running. But is there something in particular about those 2 squads that have you pretty high on them going into the season?
I think they have a tremendously high floor. Like Tennessee, you know what you're going to get with or without Zakai Ziegler. They're going to be excellent defensively. They're going to out-rebound you. They're going to play physically. And yes, I know their shortcomings, but they haven't been able to put the ball in the basket at times. And I know they lost Olivier Kamwa, who scored 27 against Duke in the second round of the tournament. But they replace him with a guy who is more productive for most games than Tobe Awaka, who is my SEC breakout player of the year. If that was an award, that's who it would be. He's going to be a double-double guy. They have Jonas Adu. They have what I think Tennessee has. They have a good mix of youth that's greedy and wants to get better and experience, like Santiago Vescovi, Josiah Jordan-James. When Zakai Ziegler comes back, this team really knows how to play. And then they have this like youthful exuberance that's going to like lead to physicality and extra possessions. And I think that's a really good mix. So I think that team, especially at the beginning of the year, is going to be far better than other teams because they have less unknowns. As for Texas A&M, I almost like them more than Tennessee compared to the consensus because a lot of people are lower on A&M. Buzz Williams has established this team to be an excellent defensive team. Like both of these teams in the SEC are going to be top 25 Ken Palm teams defensively easily, like with margin to spare. Both of these teams rebound at an excellent rate. They both shoot poorly. I think it's easier to increase your shooting percentages from one season to another than it is to establish a culture where you're going to get more possessions because you're excellent defensively. You're going to shut teams down. You're going to be a force on the board. I think Henry Coleman and Julius Marble were really good defensively last year. I think Wade Taylor's got a chance to be the SEC Player of the Year. And I know they lost Dexter Dennis, who was their best individual defender, but the rest of the A&M team stayed intact. And this was a team that was playing great basketball down the stretch. They just ran into a red-hot Penn State team in the tournament. And I think that's allowed for people to overlook them and what the product that Buzz Williams was building.
Well, we got 2 of last year's Final Four squads are in Leaf's next batch of ranked teams, as well as a Big East team in desperate need of a bounce back. We're going to get to all of that. But first, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is here, and FanDuel is giving you the best chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every single time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can use your bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking us out on YouTube as well. We're going to get back into our top 25 rankings here from our guy Leif Thulin. Talked about the top 10 there in segment number 1. Now we're going to go through 11 through 20 and chat about it, starting with the number 11 ranked team on Leaf's top 25, FAU, the Owls. Going down, we got Villanova at 12. Texas comes in at 13. Jerome Tang and Kansas State at 14. Arizona at 15. Arkansas at 16. We got a little run of West Coast schools after that. San Diego State comes in at 17. USC is at 18. The Zags are at 19. And at 20, we got Nate Oates and the Crimson Tide. Leaf, let's start at the top. FAU is, I think, one of the more difficult teams for people to rank because people in general tend to have a hard time believing in mid-major programs to replicate. But there's not really any reason to not believe in FAU. They bring back everybody. They bring back their coach. They bring back their starting 5. And this was not a team that I think a lot of people who only pay attention to college basketball in March, which is probably not a lot of people listening to a show about college basketball in late September necessarily, but I think a lot of people think of these mid-major darlings as teams that maybe just got hot at the right time. And certainly there's a degree of that with FAU, but this was a team that was darn good from the get-go last year. They were good all season long. Now they move into the AAC. It's an AAC that doesn't have Houston, that doesn't have Cincinnati, that lost some of their key talent. It still has Memphis. Still, they bring some of those good programs with them in North Texas and Charlotte and UAB and everything. But where are you kind of at with this team? Obviously, you have them just outside the top 10, so clearly a belief that this is not just some kind of flash in the pan thing. Are you kind of, I know you did the Conference USA preview, and I know you kind of talked a little bit about them departing, but what do you think about this team heading into the AAC next year?
The way I'd put it for FAU is I believe in Dusty May and the team that they built, like that the resilience in which they were able to beat a team like Memphis when it was unlikely. They were able to beat Tennessee, who's exceedingly physical, and they're a diminutive team in most positions. I believe in the character of those players. I think I may have them overranked out of deference, out of respect for what they accomplished last year. Like if you were to look at the last team that was a 9 seed made the Final Four, it was Wichita State, and they were a 1 seed. Could it happen? Absolutely. Do I think the AAC is a step up from Conference USA? Absolutely. I still think they're probably the best team in AAC with the departure of Houston. Yeah. But I mean, Memphis will be a tough game. There's going to be other games that are going to be difficult. But the reason that I remain high is it's very, very rare you have veteran guards that have winning experience in a tournament that all return. Typically, especially in today's day and age, they transfer up if they're a mid-major, or they go to the NBA if they're typically a younger team. But this team is both veterans, experience winning, same coach, and the same culture. I think they have a way of being a top 20 team for just about the entire season. It's hard to imagine they'll replicate the Final Four, but why not? Maybe they're a better team. It's just that the rest of the competition caught up to them. Or
Yep.
I'm not saying that as a slight. I just think it's hard to envision them being a Final Four contender yet again. But in terms of where the landscape is before basketball has been played, I don't see why they can't be, and that's why I have them where I do.
Most teams aren't Final Four teams 2 years in a row, so I don't think it's a knock on any program to be weary of that. Looking at the next kind of half of the top five here, you got Villanova, Texas, Kansas State, and Arizona coming in 12 through 15. And to me, this kind of little group of teams stood out because you got a lot of young coaches. You got a lot of second-year coaches. You Kansas State, of course, with Jerome Tang. You got Kyle Neptune at Villanova. Tommy Lloyd's entering his third season. Texas, obviously replaced Chris Beard with Rodney Terry. And to me, it's a kind of fun group of teams, obviously all kind of coming from different spots. Texas had a lot of success last year, but a lot of off-the-court issues. Kansas State was this kind of darling team that went on a deep run after having a successful campaign in the Big 12. Arizona has been really good under Tommy Lloyd, but has not had tournament success. And then, of course, Villanova, who you have at the top of this group, had far and away the worst regular season last year because of some injuries to some key players and a first-year coach in Kyle Neptune having to replace a legend in Jay Wright. And so I kind of wanted to just chat about this group of teams in particular and kind of think of, out of this group, who do you think maybe has the most chance to actually ascend out of the middle of the rankings into the top 10, into the top 5, maybe even be like a number 1 seed caliber team? Is there anybody in this group that kind of really stands out to you as potentially making that leap?
I would say the team that has the most likelihood of being a top 1 or 2 seed would be Arizona, just because they play good teams early. Should they win, they play Duke, for instance. Should they beat Duke, that rises you a ton. Now in the Pac-12 is actually pretty good this year, but I don't think it's as good as the Big East. No. I don't think it's as good as the Big 12, and I don't think it's as good as the SEC. So therefore, I think that gives you the advantage of, if you take care of business there, you're likely going to win your conference or be a top 2 seed in your conference. And if your conference is any good, like the Pac-12 will be, then I think you're probably a 1 or a 2 seed. Yeah. So logically speaking, I would say it's Arizona. I don't adore their team. I do love the addition of Keshad Johnson. I'm eagerly anticipating the larger role of Kylan Boswell. Yeah. I am very curious to see how Caleb Love and Jaden Bradley fit into this mix. So I don't actually love this team, but I think they've got the talent that's top 10 worthy. Yeah. I just have a little more. I would imagine most people in publications have them top 10. I don't know. I did this kind of more freelancing off the top of my head. The team I'm most excited about that I think I'm way higher than the consensus about is Villanova. Yeah. I think Villanova will shock people. And it's not because they're like some little ho-hum program. Like Virginia Villanova and Virginia have been the modicums of success in the past 10 years. Like if you were to look at most road games won, if you were to look at their conference success records, those are the 2 programs. Villanova's won 2 championships. Unfortunately, they lost Jay Wright. If they had Jay Wright with this team, I think they're the top 4 team in the country. I have questions about Kyle Neptune more than I do this team. I think Justin Moore was a shell of himself last year. Yeah. If he can be, I'm not saying he has to be exactly what he was in their Final Four run before when he got hurt in the Elite Eight against Houston, but let's just say he's 85% of that. That's going to be a top level player. Then you've got Tyler Burton from Richmond, who's the best player on a Richmond team that beat Keegan Murray in Iowa in a tournament and then developed even further. He's a 6th year. TJ Bomba's a tremendous athlete who can shoot the ball from Washington State. That's a great addition. Hakeem Hart was the leading scorer on a Maryland team that won a game in the tournament this past year. Now you have Eric Dixon, who I think is one of the better, more underappreciated players in the country, and they bring in Lance Ware from Kentucky, who adds an element of physicality and athleticism that I think Villanova has lacked, because for what Dixon provides, he's not a vertical threat. He's an interior, like post-game or stretch the floor type of guy. They could play both together. They can play one. And there's 6 players. And then, of course, you've got the shooters and stuff that Villanova always has off the bench. Jordan Longino, who I think is overrated as a player. But if he's the 7th man, he's tremendous. Yeah. I just don't think he was supposed to be a starter. And so I actually am very high in Villanova. I wouldn't be surprised if they crack the top 10 at all. The Big East is just a gauntlet, so it may be hard to consistently be within the top 10. But that's the team right now that is the front runner for the Leif Thulin is higher on them. And that typically really bodes well for teams.
Well, we'll hope that you're right if for Villanova fans out there. Speaking about teams that you're a little bit higher on, we're also going to talk about a team you're a little bit lower on here, coming in at number 19. That's, of course, the Zags. And for those of you who listens to Wednesday's show, we did our WCC conference preview, myself and co-host Isaac Shade. And we talked a little bit about some of these kind of conversations around Gonzaga. You know, is it St. Mary's turn to maybe take over the mantle and actually win the regular season outright, and kind of those things? And for Gonzaga, the conversation starts with the fact that the school's most prolific scorer of all time, and Drew Timme, is out the door, and he graduates after 4 years. And I think they made very quality additions around the new look roster. I think Graham Ike is a great addition. I think Ryan Nembhard is one of the best point guards in the entire country, but it's really hard to replace Drew Timme. And it's also hard to replace Julian Strother. And I think you look at the wing additions in Steel Venters and freshman Dusty Stromer and perhaps the South Korean Jun Sak-yo, who's going to play for the first time this year. And it's hard to say that that's going to fully replicate Julian Strother. And certainly you're not going to ever replicate Drew Timme fully, because that's just impossible to do. And so you look at this roster, you also lose key veteran guards, and Malachi Smith and Rasir Bolton are out the door. And there's a lot of newcomers. There's a lot of players who need to kind of take that leap, like Nolan Hickman, potentially Anton Watson, potentially Ben Gregg. And I think it's easy to look at this team and say, we just don't quite know what we have here. And you kind of see, I think a lot of places have them like borderline top 10. I think the Almanac had them 11. And I have never hidden that I host Locked On Zags. I talk about the Zags every single day on the show. And like, I kind of think 19 is almost a better spot for them than, like, say 11. I probably would split the difference personally, but to me, like, we just have a lot of questions about this team. In your kind of analysis on this squad, is that kind of where you're at? Is it a lot of questions? Is it just some uncertainty about where guys are going to fit, how they're going to replace some of those guys? Is that kind of the situation with this squad for you right now?
I think that, and I think the team last year was overrated.
Mm-hmm.
I think they made the Elite Eight, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure they deserve to. I
Mm-hmm.
know that sounds weird. I would argue, from being there in person, TCU was probably the better team for 30 of the 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that UCLA was the better team against Gonzaga
Mm-hmm.
for 34 of the 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And credit to Gonzaga. I'm not trying to take anything away from them. Like, Andy and I've had this discussion off the camera before.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, if a team kind of makes their way there in a almost fortuitous fashion and then loses what got them there, the three players that propelled that were Drew Timme, Julian Strother, and then you could make an argument for Anton Watson, but I would say Rasir Bolton was the third best player in those runs. And so now you have Anton Watson, Graham Ike. I love Ryan Nembhard. I'll make no bones about that. I cannot wait for Ryan Nembhard and Aiden Mahaney to guard each other. That is awesome. I can't wait for that. Just give me like a nice little 10:30 basketball action on ESPN. I cannot wait. But the reason I'm hesitant is, how good is Graham Ike really? Like, in the grand scheme of the teams that Gonzaga wants to be compared to, I think every team up there's got a Graham Ike. For instance, I talked about Texas A&M, who many people will have lower than Gonzaga. I would argue Henry Coleman's a better player than Graham Ike, and that's a team that's unheralded for their bigs. So, who's going to be your lead scorer? Is it going to be Nembhard? Is it going to be Ike? And then who's going to be the tertiary? Like, is Steel Venters actually ready to take that leap? I have a lot of questions about what players are at the caliber that Gonzaga has had. Like, Anton Watson's a known commodity. He may even take a larger role. But is he better in a larger role than he was in his, his subservient role that fed Timme, was the glue guy for a team? I don't think that's actually better for Gonzaga, even if it's better for Anton Watson. So that's my main concern. I also think that the WCC is getting better, but you're also not playing the same level of competition of everyone else throughout. So then when you play some of the same competition, it doesn't look as pretty. Whereas Gonzaga used to make up for it with talent, like being so superior. Like the year they lost to Baylor in the championship, they were exceptional.
Right.
They could have beaten anyone but Baylor that year. Like, and half the time they didn't need half their team.
Right.
But that's not the case anymore.
Yeah. Well, we're going to close out the show today with Leafs teams ranked 21 through 25 and some overall discussion on the rankings, all coming up right after this. All right, folks, segment 3 here. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball, still here with Leif Thulin going through his top 25 preseason rankings. We've done 1 through 20. Here we're going to talk 21 through 25 and a little bit about the rankings overall. Coming in at number 21 for Leif is the Baylor Bears, followed by UCLA at 22, Miami at 23, Illinois at 24, and Colorado coming in at 25, another Pac-12 school sneaking into the list here. Let's start at the top again, Leif. I want to talk about Baylor because you kind of teased talking about Baylor a little bit right there in that 2021 national championship. And I think Gonzaga and Baylor are two of the teams that are a little bit lower on your rankings than we're seeing in other places. For Baylor, of course, they also lost a ton of talent, that three-headed monster guard group of Keontae George and LJ Cryer and Adam Flagler all out the door. Dale Bonner leaves as well. They got a really talented freshman coming in Jacoby Walker. They got a nice transfer addition and Ray J. Dennis from Toledo. But is it kind of a similar situation with you for Baylor right now, or is there something about this team that has you with a little bit of pause going into the Big 12?
I think it's very similar to what I said about Gonzaga.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were overrated last year.
Mm-hmm.
They were very good on one side of the ball, very poor on the other side of the ball. And then their three best players on the side of the ball they were good at are gone. I think that Jalen Bridges is a nice player that stays. I have questions about just about everyone else. I think if Walter, their freshman, is a stud, they can elevate their ranking, but he has to be a stud.
Yeah.
And that's hard to project into a Big 12. Like the Big 12 rarely has impact freshmen dominate. Like Cade Cunningham was the number one pick, and he was one. I would even argue that Keontae George in Big 12 play, even though he's awesome, and I hope he's spectacular in the NBA for my Utah Jazz, I don't think he was that great in Big 12.
No, he didn't dominate at all. No,
I don't even think Grady Dick was that great in Big 12 play. And the reason he was considered better in Big 12 play was because he was a supplementary option to Jalen Wilson.
Right.
And so my point about this is there's a lot of moving pieces. They lost their three best players offensively. I think they'll get better defensively because Scott Drew saw like he deviated too much from what had made him successful for years by chasing too much offensive firepower. So I think they're going to regress to the mean in a positive direction defensively. I think offensively they'll regress in a negative direction, and they're going to end up about 20th in the country for most of the year. Now, if Jacoby Walter is phenomenal, that can move up. Now, if he's not great, they're going to have to scrap, and I think they'll be all right. They'll be a top 5 team in the Big 12 probably, maybe. But that's just a really tough conference to be like, solid, and you need to be exceptional to excel in that conference.
Well, let's look here after we finished up the top 25. Kind of want to talk about some of the teams that maybe didn't quite make the cut here. You got Illinois and Colorado right at the end. Who are the teams that you were kind of debating putting on this list that just didn't quite sneak in there?
One team I somewhat regret not putting in is Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin's going to be better than what their talent level indicates. I think they're going to be a top 5 team, probably top 4 team in the Big 10. And typically, if for a conference that typically pours in 8 teams, that's good enough to be top 25. I like Florida quite a bit, led by Riley Kugel, who I'm very, very high on. I also think St. Mary's, speaking of the WCC, is a team that will be of the caliber of top 25. And it's just, can they beat Gonzaga one time? Can they beat them 2 times?
Yeah.
And if they win the WCC, then great. But do I really see them as a contender? Not particularly, because I think their style of basketball is great for the regular season, but it allows for too many close games and too many things to go against them in a setting where you can get exploited for close games happening too often. And I think that's the same issue that Virginia has had the past couple of years. I think they're on the same path with Virginia, who's another team that I think is just on the borderline right here, where you make yourself susceptible to upset or just like have, even if you're a better team for the majority of the game, like Virginia was against Furman, you give too many chances. And I think St. Mary's and Virginia, both the coaches, the Bennetts, no relation, are some of the best coaches in college basketball. I adore watching both those teams play.
Yeah.
But I think there's a correlation between the ability to win in the tournament and play style. And I think both of them are on the losing end of that spectrum. And for Randy Bennett, it's not going to change because he has no capacity to recruit some of those type of teams that can do it.
Right.
But it's just, I want to make that point that I think they're top 25 throughout most of the season. I just don't see them having the same peak as some of these teams that I have in similar spaces.
I was going to totally make the no relation joke between Tony and Randy Bennett, so I'm glad you got there on that. It's always been funny to me that those teams play such similar styles. Leif, One more question for you here before we wrap this thing up. Kind of the opposite of that question you just asked. Who are teams that are in your top 25 right now that you think, hey, there's a reasonable chance? I don't think anybody was projecting that North Carolina would go from 1 to unranked last year, but are there teams you're seeing in this ranking that you're thinking, hey, I could see a situation where the wheels come off and this team is unranked throughout the year, or is even potentially a bubble team or borderline not in that NCAA tournament? Are there teams that kind of stand out as like, hey, things could go wrong here for sure?
See, that's always a tough question. You and Isaac asked that question of which top 10 team would leave the top 10 and be unranked, and it was like half of them. So I've got a few. I think San Diego State, Arkansas, Gonzaga, Alabama, and then 21 through 25, I think is kind of cheating, but I think all of these guys could bounce out because who knows if they'll even be in it. But those would be the ones that stick out to me. And if I have to choose someone within the top 10, I would go with begrudgingly Creighton.
Yeah, can see that with Creighton.
But only because they play really good competition.
Yeah.
And so if they just like have an injury or something, and then they play like a week where they play UConn and Marquette, and I don't think Creighton will, but that's just to answer the prompt. But no, I do feel confident that some of those other teams, and Baylor, toss Baylor in that too. But I think those teams that are ranked 15 through 20 to me easily could fall out, just because I think they're not as good as a lot of teams, a lot of people think they are. And they typically, for the most part of what I've said right there, play good schedules. Like, I don't know what Gonzaga's schedule is in the non-conference this year. If it's the same gauntlet it has been in years past, they could be out of the top 25, in my opinion, fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I just don't know their schedule yet.
Yeah. Leif, thank you so much for coming on the show, talking about your top 25. We're going to do some more top 25 stuff as we get into October, into November. We're going to continue to kind of look at these top teams and how the season might shake out. We, of course, got more conference previews coming your way as well. Friday's episode will include a conference preview as we get out of the month of September and into October, which just makes us 1 month closer to college hoops coming back. Thank you so much all for listening. We appreciate you who have checked out the show on YouTube. Go hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. We're hoping to get to 2,000 subscribers before the opening tip of the 2023-24 college basketball season. So go hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, as always, peace out.